Hey hey hey, 1 2 3 4 5. Geliyor mu ses şu an? Tamam mı? Ses 1 2 3 4 5 6.
Hi everybody. My name is Nicolas Seidler. I'm a policy advisor at the Internet Society. I'm co-organizing this workshop with CDT, Emma here and Matthew Shears. Thanks a lot for coming. It's great to see a packed room at the very beginning of the IGF. I hope this means we'll have a very good interactive discussion today, roundtable format. Before we start, I'd like to mention that this workshop is part of a sort of self-organized IGF fragmentation track, which basically includes our workshop, which focuses on localization, but fragmentation might be an outcome of localization or not. There will be a workshop from CIGI on the costs of fragmentation tomorrow. And on Thursday, the Internet and Jurisdiction Project will have a workshop as well on this issue and on possible multi-stakeholder frameworks to solve transnational legal issues. So at the very end, Paul and people from CIGI can give you all the details on those sessions. So why are we here? Well, over the past few months, we have seen an increasing number of initiatives or laws reflecting a sort of desire to further localize the internet within national or regional subsets. Actually, many of these reactions have been a direct follow-up to disclosures over mass pervasive surveillance. So what we will discuss today is not necessarily surveillance per se, but rather some of the policy ripples that we are actually still seeing to this day under the umbrella of internet localization. So what are we talking about in concrete terms? A few examples. For example, we've seen measures to making it mandatory for companies to build local data centers to continue operating in countries where they provide services, for example, Facebook or Twitter. There is an example of a law that was recently passed in Russia in that respect. Beyond that, there is a sort of other category of localization proposals which also relate to cables and routing. The BRICS countries have a project to build a BRICS cable. There has been a big announcement of a new undersea cable between Brazil and Europe to avoid reliance on the US to route traffic. So that's also a type of proposal that we see as well. Finally, we've seen in Europe announcements that there should be maybe a European cloud to better protect citizens at the national level. Germany as well has been really vocal in saying, oh, we can do a national email system that is more secure as well. So we'll get back to these examples during the discussion. So it really seems that national territories sort of making a comeback on the internet, if it actually ever left. But localization is actually a very mixed picture, I think we will find out in this panel. If we take the example of internet exchange points, which allow to peer local traffic, sort of keep local traffic local, that can be a very positive force to improve the speed and reduce the costs of internet traffic. As well, more cables can also generally be a good thing for internet resilience. So it's a really mixed picture. And the question is, how can we make the difference between good and bad localization policies as a response to surveillance? How can we distinguish between those which are useful for the internet and for users from those that could maybe possibly lead to a fragmentation of the network? So our speakers here will help us hopefully make the difference. So this is my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. On the very left, Sunil Abram from the Center of Internet and Society in India. Yari Arko from the Internet Engineering Task Force. On his right, Kenneth Carter from Cloudflare, cloud providing company. Christian Kaufmann from Akamai. Chris Riley from Mozilla, And on the very right, Em Alonso from the Center of Democracy and Technology, CDT. So let's dive into it. Just so you be prepared, I would like to have a very interactive discussion, and I see many people here who will probably have very good insights to provide, which is, I guess, the good thing at the IGF. You have as much expertise in the audience than on the panel, so that's a really good thing. So I would like to start to ask the panelists their thoughts on the sort of first bucket of localization proposals. The first bucket I would like to talk to are these requirements to store data within a specific jurisdiction. So we've seen several examples of making it mandatory to require storing critical data on servers physically located inside the country. Just 3 examples, there are many more, but just to give an idea. Early 2014 in India, the Indian National Security Council has proposed to keep the data related to communications among Indians within the country. So that means all email service providers may be mandated to host servers for their Indian operations within India. And all data generated from within India should be hosted in these Indian-based servers, which would make them subject to Indian laws. So that's one example. Another one in Russia, in July 2014, President Putin signed a law that would require operators to process and store Russians' national personal data within Russia. The new law would require companies serving traffic within Russia to stay in Russia and be logged for at least 6 months, starting in September 2016. Last example, well, basically in Brazil, originally in the Marco Civil, there was the intent to force operators of online services to store Brazilian data only in Brazilian data center, but that didn't make the cut in the final version of the Marco Civil. So basically 2 cross-cutting questions for the panel. The first one, can actually such focus on the geographical location of data be effective in actually increasing the privacy of users and reduce foreign surveillance? First question, is that effective for the intent that is expressed by these initiatives? And the second question, beyond privacy, what are the risks and benefits of these measures on user choice, on innovation, on business decisions, on expression online, on how the internet works? Basically, what are the sort of side effects of those measures, whether good or bad? So please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, if I start quickly on the first one, is it effective in terms of providing privacy? And I claim that that's actually pretty difficult, because I mean, countries are basically large entities, and there's lots of networking there, lots of people, lots of networks in between you and someone else when you communicate. So and there's number of companies and types of equipment involved when you do anything. So if all you are doing is sort of drawing this border around the network, you're not that secure. All it takes is one entity somewhere along the path to be compromised in some fashion. And we've seen examples of countries demanding that their companies, for instance, hand over data even in their overseas operations. So it's not clear that this directly helps. I probably advocate other types of solutions more, like relying on encryption and cutting the number of participants seeing your communications. That would be, I think, more effective than pure drawing of maps. But I'm not necessarily 100% opposed. There's no yes, no answer here. Depends on what you're doing. If you're the government and you are asking for some of your critical services to be done by some contractor, of course you can set your requirements and keep the data of your healthcare system in the country, for instance. That's completely fine.
I
do agree with everything Yari said. I want to add to that. I mean, to the extent that this, a lot of these localization proposals are a response to anxiety over US government surveillance, but every government engages in surveillance. So for the fundamental privacy of the internet user, I don't think these really help a whole lot. And in many countries, I'm not sure they would even help with US surveillance. But I mean, my bigger motivation on this is the second of your questions. What does this do for the internet and for openness of the internet? And I mean, Mozilla was built as an organization to advance the open internet, and it's definitely our view that mandated localization is contrary to the principle of the open internet. We, as an organization, we don't even practice staff localization at Mozilla. When we hire somebody, we want them to stay where they are, and they work via video conference and remotely. We have remote teams of employees from all over the world. So we don't even want our staff to be localized, much less their internet use.
Hi. And just to add in agreement with Yari and Chris, I think to the extent that these data localization mandates are presented to people as, you know, this is a way to keep your data in your country protected by your laws, that really requires the cooperation of the government where the company is located. And it's not clear that you're always going to be getting that cooperation. So a good example of this is the current Microsoft Ireland case. This is a case where US law enforcement is trying to compel Microsoft to turn over content information for subscribers that it stores on a data center in Ireland. And Microsoft is challenging this order, saying this is, you know, extraterritorial use of warrants by US law enforcement to seize data that is held in Ireland. They should be using the MLAT process, the multilateral legal assistance treaty process to go through official channels to get this data. They should not, the US government should not be compelling Microsoft to turn over this data that's stored in a foreign country. And the US government's response in the case is that, well, no, we're not, this has nothing to do about us going into Ireland. Microsoft is a US corporation, and we're telling a US corporation in the US to turn over information that they have control of. So if you have these two very fundamentally different ideas about what does it mean to seize data, what does it mean for data to be governed by a particular country's laws, then I see data localization mandates not necessarily being responsive to keeping an individual's data private. Is going to put more companies in this position of tension between the laws of two different countries, which is not necessarily going to do anything positive for user rights.
Thanks, Emma. That's a nice. I'll get back to you, Kenneth. So Emma, you mentioned that creates, I guess, difficulties for businesses on how they can respond to those requests. So Kenneth, as a cloud provider.
I wanted to speak directly to that. My name is Ken Carter. I work for a company called Cloudflare. I want to tell you very quickly about my business first and what these implications might mean, what the implications of these changes might mean for us. Cloudflare provides web security, DDoS mitigation, and CDN, plus a variety of other features. We do this by having 28 points of presence globally in 20 countries on 5, soon to be 6 continents. From those data centers, we broadcast the same IP addresses so that we can absorb attacks which originate all over the world. The network learns from what it sees. In any given hour, we see about 7% of IP addresses. We're handling about 5% of web requests. So the network grows smarter based on the information it sees. And that data is all aggregated. We can't keep it. It's just too much. We're generating about an iPhone of data every couple of minutes. So we have to aggregate it and purge. But we cannot provide a global service acting locally. We see threats emerging in certain countries, and we use them to protect customers in other countries, use that information to protect customers in other countries. So to the extent that we were forced to localize, we could not comply with that law, and we could not do business in that country. That's the bad news. The good news is, as a starting up company, transparency is one of our competitive assets, and we tell our customers exactly what we do. Here's what we have a very simple, very readable privacy policy. We publish a transparency report semi-annually so that our customers know what we do with their data.
Thanks. Kenneth and then Sunil. Christian and then Sunil.
Hi, I'm Christian from Akamai. We have a relatively similar business than Cloudflare, so it's good to compare that part. If you are a global business and you roll out your services in a lot of countries, but every country reacts differently and you have to adapt from a legal perspective, then that introduces costs. Every time you have to have additional servers for log files, data retention, you need policy people to actually understand what's going on in that particular country. Then that adds complexity and costs, which end of the day, either the customer or the end user have to pay for. So if you go for data localization on a legal perspective and handle that differently, that increases costs for all of us. On top of that, it makes it actually for startup companies more difficult to do something. Startup companies rely on a global scale that everything in the internet kind of works the same, and if you send the data packet to India or to Germany to the US, it's the same. There is no difference in that part. If you have to do it different in every case, then as a startup you probably can't do it. So that certainly hinders innovations. It also fragments the market so that just the big companies have a benefit and the smaller ones have actually an entrance barrier. On top of that, as a positive point, it probably helps your country and the companies in that country, because now they can make a more customized, tailored solution. But everything which is a global service is certainly a problem. Imagine a random social media, something like Facebook you're using. The benefit is that you can use it with all your friends, all over the world. But if everyone has a different social media in every country which are not connected, you either have to be part of 20 of them, or you basically just see your local friends. Imagine that.
So Christian, just a follow-up question. So what are the criteria in general that goes into deciding where you are going to locate the server? Is that the regulation of the country? Is that the costs of putting that server?
Probably we should have started with an introduction and a disclaimer. There is a big difference, and talking more about me, but I guess it's partially true for Cloudflare as well, between data localization and data localization. What CDNs do is we bring content closer to the end user, but that content for most of the times is not specific. I mean, if the person in India, for my example, or in Germany downloads a particular website, the website is really the same. There's not necessarily end user data coming with it. So we deliver the same picture or the same video. But if you actually buy something like in a shop, then these personal data, your credit card information, where you live, all your personal part is actually not with the CDN, it's with the owner of the shop for which we distribute the content. So we are a little bit like an ISP, like a delivery mechanism, but we actually do not see or own your private data. So when we put servers in various countries, we do that for performance, scalability, redundancy, all these economical and technical aspects. We don't do it for political ones. We don't see your end user data. The end user data, if you buy something from a customer of us, goes to his server. But his server might now be centralized somewhere, wherever he is. But the server where you get the content from and the video is then in the particular countries. But we do not see the end user data. So in that part, that's the CDN business. That is done since 15, 20 years. So since the beginning of the internet. So there's nothing specific there. But that we are now the idea that we're now fragmenting the end user data, so that the end user data and all your privacy stuff stays in the country, is a new concept.
Thanks, Christian. Sunil, would you like to share some perspectives maybe on the Indian proposals as well?
Everybody on the panel so far has agreed vehemently. So to make things a little more exciting for the people in this room, I will try and disagree. On the first thing, which is surveillance, what our panel members have told us is it makes no difference. Surveillance will be exactly the same. But just compare the people of India and the people of China. The people of China are surveilled upon by their government the people of India are surveilled upon by our government and the US government. So that's one government less. So it does make some difference if it is technically possible, and all of us know that's a really big if. Second, in terms of startup companies, I have always believed that evil is a function of size. The smaller you are, the less potential you have for harm. And since you have less potential for harm, the governments are less interested in you. So governments rarely send user data requests to small companies, but they do regularly with large companies. So therefore, the argument which distinguishes small companies from large companies perhaps does not hold. Number three is mostly about the drama, because finally, the government wants equal treatment. If the US government has such pervasive access to data sets from the global internet giants, then all the Indian government wants is to have roughly the same access. And what you see mostly is the big dance in the media. The Indian government wants such and such from BlackBerry, and BlackBerry says, oh no, that's not technically feasible, and so on. And almost all these stories kind of whimper out. And we never hear the end of the story because, according to civil society, some deal is struck. So a data localization request is not so much a serious policy proposal as much as it is a negotiation technique. And more recently we've heard Twitter and Facebook and Google, etc., who previously stood before Indian courts and said, we just do marketing services in this country, we have nothing to do with the servers, now saying we will comply with the requirements of Indian law. So in that sense, we should see data localization as drama rather than anything else. Taxation. This is very interesting because all our internet giants are also experts at what they call tax minimization, what other people call tax avoidance. And in the Indian Income Tax Act, Section 9(1)(a), in the case of a business of which all operations are not carried out in India, income of the business deemed under this clause to accrue or arise in India shall only be part of the income as reasonably attributed to the operations carried out in India. So the data localization requirement also strengthens the case of the tax authorities, because they can then claim that the party providing the service and the party accessing the service and all intermediaries between them, such as CDNs, are all within the nation state, and therefore those transactions should be taxed within India. Finally, what China does with its history of data localization mandates is really created a preferential market access, and it helps local companies build. Of course, there are many other aspects to it. Unfortunately, in India, because local companies are not that competent, that's not a useful strategy for us. It isn't as if an Indian organization can build a globally acceptable search engine or social network. So that argument works in a particular country but doesn't work in all countries. Thank you.
So that's very interesting because, yeah, actually many assumptions as well on these data localization requirements are that, in a way, that's also a strategy for governments or for countries to sort of boost, sort of own national products compared to the international competition. That's an interesting point as well that you make between big and small companies. Are big companies going to, in any case, compromise with government requests to stay in the market? That can be a case. I'd actually would like to open the floor now. I think that's been a very good overview and good insights already on this topic. So please raise your hands and ask questions. Rudolf, OECD.
Yes, Rudolf van der Burg, OECD. What I think is often forgotten with these data localization requests is that there are actually many economic reasons why data is brought outside the country. Because under normal circumstances, you wouldn't necessarily bring the data out of the country for practical purposes, you won't route from Delhi to Mumbai via London. That just doesn't make sense. But in the way the internet works in many countries at the moment, it does make sense. First of all, we have telecommunications companies who refuse to interconnect locally unless they get paid massive transit fees. That is a problem. We have several countries that still do not have internet exchange points. So that makes for major problems. We have countries that have very unreliable electricity and difficulty of ease of doing business, and that makes that most of their websites are hosted outside the country. We did a survey at the OECD together with Pingdom that showed, for example, that to take two countries which are a bit rivalrous and a member, Greece, 19% of websites hosted under .gr are hosted in Greece out of the Alexa top 1 million most popular sites. 81% of Turkish most popular sites are hosted in Turkey. That just shows a difference. The countries aren't too far apart, so you wouldn't think that regional differences make much of a difference, both OECD countries. But for the Greeks, 81% of their sites are hosted, of the .gr sites, are hosted in Germany, the US, Netherlands, places like that. If you have data localization rules, well, you may first want to just have a look at your own market and see what's wrong there, why the data is outside. And the same goes for traffic that's routed abroad. Why does every Middle Eastern telco route its traffic via London? Or when you send traffic, I think it was from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia, it literally goes around the world. It literally goes via the US, via Japan, from one country to another. That just doesn't make sense. And if you then are afraid for spying, well, maybe you brought it on yourself.
Thanks, Rudolf. Any reactions from the panel? Otherwise, any other question from the floor? Yeah, please. Chandra.
John Selby, Macquarie University. I'm interested in your thoughts about what might happen if these are implemented, if we see trade disputes forming as a result. Under the GATS, for example, trade in internet services, we had mentioned of preferential market access for localised services. We might see World Trade Organization dispute settlement bodies resolving these issues, and I'm interested in your thoughts about internet stakeholders' engagement with those processes.
Anybody? Trade issues? No? Okay, I'll take the next one and you can think about it. The lady here and then the gentleman over there.
Thanks. My name is Sarah Ludford. I was until May a member of the European Parliament. I'm now a member of the UK Parliament, the Upper House. I'm sorry I missed some of the panel, but I came in just as the speaker at the end here was talking, but it seems to me talking about the example of Microsoft and data in Ireland. But I was involved in negotiations on the new EU data protection legislation, where we tried, indeed we deliberately in a sense set up that tension to say that data belonging to Europeans could not be handed over to a foreign court, i.e. FISA, without there being an international agreement to govern that. So it seems to me, and yeah, I'm afraid I'm on a learning curve here. I'm not the experts that many of you are, but it's less about the sort of physical localization of the data. It's about legal jurisdiction. I mean, it's about claims for territorial and extraterritorial jurisdiction, and what is the definition of extraterritorial. But the approach from the European Parliament in the data protection reform was that it's about data belonging to Europeans. Doesn't matter where it is. It has got European jurisdiction over it if it belongs to Europeans. So I think, to me, it is more about the kind of legal jurisdictional issues.
So that's a very good question. Is it less about the physical location of data than the people who own the data? And then Paul, you can jump in on your panel, please.
Oh, no, absolutely. I think, I think your comment points exactly to the point that protection for users' data is going to come from legal and policy reform, is going to come from, in this case, the US and the EU working out, or the US and Ireland in the Microsoft Ireland case, coming to an agreement that they're going to use the MLAT process as opposed to this compulsion of data just based on the fact that Microsoft is incorporated in the US. And so I think that's, when we talk about data localization, it's important to be very precise about what do we mean. Are we talking about a legal mandate that you cannot serve the people in a particular country without having a server in that country? Or are we talking, and that is a very particular kind of mandate, and I think that's what is concerning many of the panelists, the idea that there would be this barrier to providing services to a global internet because you cannot afford to put a server in country X. But questions of jurisdiction have always been a challenge for online data flows, and the considerations that Christian was talking about of what are the considerations that a company makes when deciding to put a server and to put themselves in the jurisdiction of a particular country. I mean, those are very important, and I think that's something that each of these companies is having to work through.
Thanks, Emma. And at the same time, I think it's getting increasingly complicated to. I can be a Swiss citizen and set up a Gmail account in Australia claiming that I'm from Germany. So I guess at the same time, finding the jurisdiction that applies is a very difficult thing. Kenneth, then Sunil, and then Paul.
I wanted to respond directly with a request, and that I ask you to do this very judiciously and not create for a company like Cloudflare conflicting legal duties. Cloudflare is EU Safe Harbor certified. We tell our customers what we do with their data. But if I get a FISA order, if I were to get a FISA order, I would have to obey that order. To do otherwise would be in violation of the law. You might not like the FISA court. It is, however, a court. Being a court doesn't ensure great legal jurisprudence necessarily. If you look at our Supreme Court, it's brought you such cases as Dred Scott, Korematsu v. US, and Bush v. Gore. All of those are really bad outcomes, but it is a court. So I ask that just to be mindful of the fact that if I have two conflicting legal obligations, I'm not sure how I would resolve that.
Sunil?
Perhaps a small point on the whether data localization requirements will be in violation of international trade agreements. I think there are exceptions in these trade agreements specifically for national security, and those are the very same exceptions that the US government exercises to prevent ZTE and Huawei equipment from being used in the US internet backhaul. So similarly, it will be justified, and as we know, whether it's free speech or data localization, national security is a magic word and can accomplish absolutely anything. But of course, somebody will have to test this by taking a complaint. On the MLAT, and Paul will be able to talk to this in a lot more detail because the Internet Jurisdiction Project is looking at this question closely. One of the senior members of the Central Bureau of Investigation in India, who's now heading some kind of coordination project in Singapore, told us that the average length for an MLAT process is 2 years. And by then, all other evidence has disappeared, and very difficult to successfully prosecute somebody in India if you go through the MLAT process. That's why the governments continue to put pressure on the large internet corporations. Thank you.
So first, Paul, Yari, and then we'll take another question. So Paul, is one of the reasons we see all these requirements a result of a weak MLAT process, for example, weak legal assistance?
Yes, I think so. My name is Paul Fenninger from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. I think the problem is that the traditional modes of interstate legal cooperation that we have today are not adapted to the realities of the cross-border Internet, where most online interactions simultaneously involve multiple jurisdictions at the same time based on the location of the user, the location of the servers, and the location of the operators. As Emma, Sunil, and the lady from the European Parliament already alluded to, the MLAT was not designed for this. It's not appropriate to handle those new realities. So basically, if we want to avoid a refragmentation of cyberspaces, of the server infrastructure, and so on and so forth, we need to develop appropriate frameworks to handle transnational requests for user data in an appropriate manner to guarantee due process and transparency. And this is what the Internet and Jurisdiction Project wants to achieve. And something that might be interesting in the debate is also to have a look at the Marco Civil. In the Marco Civil, there was a long debate whether to include the requirement to store data locally or not. What is now included in the final Marco Civil is a provision that actually establishes Brazilian jurisdiction for every user data related to a Brazilian citizen, regardless where the data is stored. And this is also a similar philosophy that we see in the European Union in terms of data protection and how this works. So I think this will be the new standard, that regardless of where data is stored, we need to find ways that national jurisdictions still apply.
So just a follow-up remark by Sunil, Yari, and then, sorry, thanks, you've been patient.
I think in 2008, the Indian IT Act already made such a claim that if harm is caused to Indians or to Indian property, then Indian jurisdiction will apply. But it's mostly a meaningless statement in law, because why will law enforcement in another country accept your expansion of jurisdiction? So, I mean, it sounds like a solution, but it really isn't, till there is heavy overlap in both substantive and procedural law. Thank you.
Yeah, so many problems, what to do. I think it might actually be useful to try to turn this discussion around a little bit to thinking about what can we do, what are the useful things, and I mean, I certainly agree with Sunil that pervasive surveillance is a bad thing, and we need to do everything we can to reduce its effects. But what is it that would be effective? I think obviously, as noted earlier, more IXPs, more cables, technically those things are very good. We should do that. That's a clear task for all of us in the industry. But also, as Rudolf pointed out, they're not always used because of perhaps competition or other issues. I think there's a role for governments and regulators and competition agencies in countries to look at this, make sure there's nothing that blocks their country from employing all of those good things. Another thing that I think would actually be useful is to have some visibility or understanding to the societies and even individual users of where their data is, just so people understand what's happening. And related to that, I think it would actually be a useful thing that instead of thinking about this as governments fighting or court cases and such, what if this privacy thing and the good service, that this particular cloud service gives you good protection against all kinds of bad things? What if that was actually something that the users would think about and would pick those services over the ones that have worse performance? I think that is something that we should actually try to generate in the world. And there, I think there's possibilities for that. I'm maybe speaking in favor of my own country, because in Finland we currently have a good situation with regards to surveillance and so forth. So services done in our country could probably be marketed in for these reasons. Although the Finnish government may not be clever enough to actually hold this current situation, because they're considering adding some silly regulation to do further surveillance or do some surveillance. But I think it would be a really, really important thing for the world to start thinking about what is it that we're using and is it good enough for our purposes, as opposed to just dictating that in this country you have to do X.
Thanks, Yari. I think there's going to be many points where we can get back to, can we create a positive market, like privacy havens, encryption. Please just hold your thoughts. Gentlemen, you've been very patient. Do you have a question for the panel? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Godwin. I'm most recently with Internews, but I'm speaking in my individual capacity today. I think one of the questions that I would like to see the panel squarely address is what seems apparent to a lot of civil libertarians, which is that the data localization requirements that are being promoted as a response to bulk surveillance by the United States and by the United Kingdom, in fact, are being sought, at least by some governments, to enable greater surveillance over their own citizens. Why is this not being squarely addressed as the covert agenda, in the post-Snowden revelation era? In Thailand, prior to the recent change in government, the Royal Thai Police were seeking subscriber information from Thai users of a Thai social network that was based in Japan. And the thing that stopped them from getting that information about their Thai citizens was Japanese jurisdiction. They were unable or unwilling to navigate Japanese procedural protections to get the information on Thai citizens using the Japanese-based Thai social network. It certainly is a better world for policemen in which data localization is required everywhere, but how is it better for ordinary people?
Good question. Are we replacing foreign surveillance by potentially more national surveillance? Okay. Is there a risk for that?
Yeah, so from what I understand, if you look at any of the surveillance measures of the Indian government, this is the central monitoring system, the NAT grid, none of them will accomplish 100% surveillance of the population. They are all targeted surveillance measures. It must be only the US government that engages in this type of blanket surveillance. So I don't know enough about China to speak authoritatively to that question. But in India, surely Indians would prefer targeted surveillance to blanket surveillance. So that's a very easy question to answer. Thank you.
That wasn't the question I asked. Sorry.
Mike,
You go ahead, Chris.
No, I mean, I do think I know your point. I alluded to it a little bit in my opening remarks, which is, to the extent that's probably a little hot. To the extent that these are a reaction to Snowden, it doesn't really help with individual internet user privacy because every government engages in surveillance. And there are some that engage in very, very aggressive surveillance all around the world. I want to sort of see if I can offer a couple of principles here to help think about these and to get to Yari's point as well at helping us bridge so that this is not just the localization laws panel, but rather all things localization. I think there's an initial question, which is whether what's being sought is sort of increased access through legal measures to data for purposes legitimate or illegitimate as one interprets based on the context. And then there's technical, right? And a lot of the reasons why there was the sort of vitriolic reaction at the beginning of this panel was from the technical side, right? So within the technical side, there's also a subdivision, which is whether what we're talking about is an additive mechanism for increased technical access locally, such as adding internet exchange points or adding cables. And then there's a negative version of the technical spectrum here, which is mandates that limit the free flow of information around the world. That's the thing that I react most strongly and most negatively to, and I expect many of my compatriots here on the panel will as well. Then the legal side is entirely different, and there's a subdivision there as well between sort of direct legal jurisdiction, like the Marco Civil inclusion that Paul mentioned, like what the US and the EU are doing. The Microsoft case is a good example of this, trying to get to direct access to data through legal mechanisms without having to go through any other countries, just by saying, If you are touching my citizens or if you exist in my country, I have jurisdiction over you. And then there are international mechanisms like the MLAT reform. So we've got legal and technical. Within technical, we've got additive and negative. Within legal, we've got direct and international. And in my head, I put a check mark on 2 of these boxes. I think technical additive measures like IXPs and cables, although you could say they increase some countries' capacity for surveillance, are nevertheless, in my book, good things because they improve the openness and the free flow of information. I would say the same thing about MLAT reforms. I think MLAT reforms are something that most of us in this room would love to see. We'd love to see less than 2 years to process an MLAT claim so that we can effectively realize the goals of that legal system in the internet world. I have a big red X in my head on technical negative measures, on things that restrict the free flow of information, and over direct legal jurisdictions I have a question mark, because I think it's complicated and very contextually driven. So I don't know if that helps, but I wanted to lay that out in case it's helpful for other people as they engage with these things.
And I wish we had a whiteboard for, because I think it's what you call the technical additive, things like IXPs or, or efforts to use the CDN or other ways of voluntarily localizing data and information in a particular country. And to Mike's point, I think when we're thinking even through these the technical additive mechanisms, what we need is to be able to think not just from the technical side, but also from the legal and policy side. What are the laws? What are, at this IXP, who is connecting, who controls it, who is able to use it for, all of the benefits of bringing an internet exchange point, but can many governments come in and surveil there? And so I think, I guess to Mike's point, as we're looking through these different localization mandates or proposals, to really think not just, what would this mean for U.S. surveillance, U.S. capacity to surveil, but also for domestic surveillance. I have this instinct of trying to separate the technical and the political, but as Sunil points out, these are very much negotiating tactics. These are very much proposals that are brought about, yes, to pursue maybe a national aim of increased surveillance of people in that country, but also to push back against NSA surveillance and to push back against global surveillance. So I think it's, as much as I want to see that, I really do want to see that drawn up for everybody, but I think we're going to just kind of keep coming back into these circular conversations because there are multiple motives to each of these proposals.
Thanks, and I wish we had a whiteboard. Just a question, do we have any questions or remarks from remote participants? Or no? Okay. So I would just like to briefly get back to one of the points that Yari made. If we now sort of take a positive approach of, what can we, what could we do to address surveillance? You mentioned that, actually offering probably better services would be one thing. In terms of government reactions, for example, Germany has stepped up and they said, actually Deutsche Telekom, they've created a national email system, which they claim is more secure for citizens, encrypted. So that's one thing. Me coming from Switzerland, we start to see in Switzerland a big push from some companies saying that, okay, we are based in Switzerland, we have a very good legal framework here, we can be a safe haven to store data. So what are your thoughts, for example, Yari, on those claims that there can be, a more privacy protecting sort of national email system, for example?
Yeah, so I'm not a big friend of national email systems until remembering the times when we had disconnected islands of emails and that communicate from one company to the other. So it's really, a lot of the value for the internet comes from the global nature. We all have friends and relatives and suppliers and customers in different places. So we need the global nature of the internet, but I'd actually advocate, instead of geographic localization, I'd advocate, let's call it cryptographic localization, that you actually use technology to limit the number of people, not the area, but the entities having access to your data. You could do a lot with that. I'm not familiar with the details of the particular proposals in Germany and elsewhere, but I think there's technology that today can be turned on, like, you know, email server to server encryption as an example would be useful. And I think we need to look at those kinds of things. That's one of the additive technical measures, and not just IXPs and cables, but dealing with higher level mechanisms.
So are basically users better have to protect themselves with, you know, their own cryptographic tools, or can
no, I think the users can do that, certainly, but there's also a lot of that the various service providers can do, like, you know, server-to-server protection, as opposed to end user to end user. End user to end user in email, for instance, is relatively difficult technically today, unfortunately.
Even in India, there is a proposal. I think there have been opportunities on which the Supreme Court has scolded the government, saying government bureaucrats and MPs should stop using Google and other free email services. But the tragedy is the fix is yet another centralized solution. So you must use one single government provider and that email service, and that service is not very reliable, and therefore bureaucrats don't use it. What we should have instead is a multiplicity, both vibrant local markets and also vibrant international service providers who can provide a secure email. And that's a complication, because the years of free email provision has resulted in a situation where we can't afford mail administrators anymore in Bangalore, and they don't exist, mail server administrators, they don't exist, that breed of professionals. 15 years ago, I could administer my own mail server, but today administering a mail server has become quite a complicated thing. So, very difficult to overnight build capacity, whether it's fiber or whether it's human capacity, and the solution of a centralized national service is as vulnerable as using an international service. The trouble with cryptographic solutions, unfortunately, is that they interfere with FOIA and what in India we call the right to information or public records requirements, that the government after a particular period should have access to everything that the bureaucrats do. So if we carve it up so finely using cryptography, then very difficult for the government to know what its bureaucrats are doing as well from a public records perspective.
Thanks, Sunil. Marco from RIPE NCC.
Yes. Is this not on? Yeah. Marco Welgewoningen, RIPE NCC, one of the regional internet registries. I'm kind of with the previous speaker and with Jari, and that some of this can be done technically, but indeed the customer will pick whatever he thinks is the best service, and we shouldn't drive him into a certain direction. And I don't think indeed national email systems would be a great solution to the problem. But as far as we can take it technically, and I think Paul was on that track as well, is there's also a whole other thing. And we have to acknowledge that the internet is largely built on trust. And as far as Jari and his smart people in the IGF can take it technically, everything can be broken. Every encryption sooner or later will give way because computer technology enhances. And to that sense, and back to capacity building, I think it's also vital to make users aware to not only trust on technology, also be smart on where they go. And so what I would like to know from the panel is, how far do you think can we take this with technology, and how far should we aim our capacity building in raising that awareness, and, for instance, as Paul said, adopting other, for instance, legal matters to the reality of today's internet, and that is that it is borderless, and technological developments go that fast that it's almost impossible to keep up with legislative processes.
Thanks, Marco. So technology is there, but it's not necessarily easy for users to implement. How can we build capacity for users to use the network in a secure way? Can companies help? Can governments help?
I guess to a couple of your points. First, all encryption at any given time is unbreakable. Otherwise, it's not encrypted. So this gets to be a cat and mouse game, which develops ever stronger encryption, ever better breaking tools, ever better, stronger encryption, and so forth. To answer your question, there are things that companies can do. Obviously, disclosure and making it easier to use these resources. We're, in the next month or so, enabling SSL for free for all of our customers, all 2 million of our customers, in the hope that our network will get more secure and reliable. There was one other point, but I'm sorry it escapes me. I hope it'll come back to me, but I'll give the other panel.
Sunil, Yari, and then Christian, and then a very last round of 1 or 2 questions if you have some.
The purpose of encryption is not to make surveillance impossible, as Bruce Schneier says, but to make surveillance more and more expensive. So that's all we're trying to do.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I mean, there's no perfect security, you're completely right, what we're trying to do is to mitigate some of these threats, at least to an extent, and means reducing the number of parties that have your data, thinking about who you want to have your data with, thinking about what data you want to have to begin with in anywhere. And all of those things, I think there's no silver bullet here. We can't say that we must solve this with technology. That's not what I meant. But I think technology is one component, and we also need, the deployment aspect of putting in more IXPs, the regulatory aspect of making sure the competition works in the country that you can actually connect to the IXP, the legal aspects of how do we work in this global world where there's multiple countries. All of those things are needed.
Christian?
This is not primarily a technical discussion. I mean, most of the technologies for encryption, harder encryption, all these kind of things are out, but just barely anyone is actually using it. If you look how many people are signed up to social media, to localization services as Foursquare or whatever, where you not just tell your location, what you're doing, your hobbies, all that kind of stuff, where you even upload pictures which are afterwards no longer belong to you, and then you have a discussion about SSL encryption and which one is more secure, after you have signed up with 20 different companies in 20 different countries where you pass on your private data, then I think the discussion of where you get surveilled and which kind of encryption you should use is not really the point.
Okay, so some user responsibility as well. A last question over there.
Hello, I'm Prashant Sugatan from SFLC.ai. My question is with the ITU Plenipot coming up, will a binding legal instrument which prevents or restricts countries from doing arbitrary mass surveillance of other citizens in other countries, will that be a solution?
Any thoughts? Sunil?
So I've asked this question a couple of times before, and I'd like to ask it again. Give me one example of an individual whose rights have been infringed upon, getting redress through the multi-stakeholder model. And so far nobody has answered this question. I'm very keen to hear answers, because multi-stakeholderism really is merely open, consultative self-regulation of the private sector. And it's a legitimate thing, because governments really don't know how to regulate in this space. They don't have the competence, expertise, and therefore, if the private sector can mitigate harm through self-regulation, then that's a good thing, and everybody should encourage it through the multi-stakeholder process. So if human rights cannot be enforced through the multi-stakeholder process, then you already know the answer to the question. The trouble is whether the ITU is the right place for such an instrument. We need hard law to enforce rights, But the complication is, does ITU have a track record of enforcing human rights? And if it doesn't, then we may not have a fora where you will get the solution you want. Thank you.
Chris?
I think that's a bit of a false choice there. I mean, I would not say you're thinking about multi-stakeholder models in the right way if you're expecting IGF to resolve an individual complaint of a rights violation, right? I mean, there's a few layers in between there. The multi-stakeholder processes end up shaping and influencing individual legal frameworks, which end up being the place where people's rights are violated. People's rights aren't violated by international frameworks as often as they are practices in individual countries either. So I wanted to make sure that people aren't thinking we need something more directly to protect rights than the systems that we already have. I mean, rights are obviously under threat, it's a challenging problem, but we have a lot of different mechanisms within the multi-stakeholder system, including the Freedom Online Coalition and others that are working very hard at an international layer to help address this problem. But I think the question about the plenipot is a very good one. I think Christian was shaking his head quietly over here, and I was pointing over to him in agreement. No, I don't think there's a prospect or a very high likelihood of some mechanism effectively being able to end arbitrary and mass surveillance. I just don't think it's that easy or straightforward. I mean, I'm not sure I would mind if that were to happen, but it's impossible for me to conceive of it. So.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that's a very interesting discussion that we could start now, but it's the hour. I think what we got from it is that, I mean, on this issue, there is no silver bullet for surveillance, definitely. There are technical, legal aspects. The government may be useful in some cases, building more cables, providing privacy protections. I think user choice to have good options to store their data is very important as well. So I hope this has been an interesting discussion for you. The dialogue is not over. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a track at the IGF. I don't know, is there anybody from CIGI who's organizing the workshop tomorrow? So would you like to very briefly let us know when your workshop is and what's the angle briefly, and then Paul, and then we'll conclude.
Sure. So tomorrow's workshop is going to look at the costs of internet fragmentation. It's going to be in workshop room 9, starting at 5.
Short and sweet. Paul?
So the workshop by the Internet and Jurisdiction Project is going to be on Thursday at 2:30 p.m. in room 2, and it will deal with the question, will cyberspace fragment along national jurisdictions? And there's also a flash session of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project at 11:30 in room 2 today. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and please join me in thanking the panel for this discussion.